Chapter 11. Earl's face lit up with an innocent smile, and his relaxed demeanor caught Bianca off guard. She had expected him to ask for something demanding, maybe even jokingly suggest something dramatic like a lifetime promise. But all Earl asked for was a meal. Bianca was touched but also a little annoyed. She teased, "Does my life only deserve a single meal? It's not like that. Earl stammered, looking flustered. Seeing his panic, Bianca couldn't hold back her laughter. Her radiant smile bloomed like a field of flowers, glowing under the starlight and making her look utterly enchanting. She said, her tone softening, "I'm just kidding. I just wanted to repay you, that's all." Earl froze, utterly captivated by her beauty. To him, Bianca had always been the epitome of grace and intellect, perhaps even a little cold, an untouchable goddess. But this playful side of her, so grounded and approachable, felt like a fairy being stepping into the mortal world. Realizing Earl was staring, Bianca's cheeks turned a faint pink. She lowered her gaze slightly and said, "Earl, thank you. I'd love to treat you to a meal, but I'll be leaving for Alnugo tomorrow morning." Alnugo, one of the nation's largest cities, was as renowned as the capital, yet it was thousands of miles from Perth City. Once she left, the chances of meeting again were slim. Earl blinked in surprise. "You're going to Alnugo?" A trace of melancholy crossed Bianca's face. She explained softly, "I'm planning to apply to Alnugo University. My parents are moving there as well." As the leading college in the municipality, Alnugo University carried over a century of prestige. Since modern times, it had nurtured countless prominent figures and was ranked among the country's top 5 colleges. To gain admission, one needed to be the best of the best. From Bianca's calm and confident demeanor, it was clear she was determined to succeed. Earl gave a faint smile. "How about you treat me to that meal if fate allows us to meet again? Who knows, I might end up at Alnugo University too," he said casually. "Really?" Bianca's eyes sparkled with hope. She continued, "Then, can I have your phone number? I'll change my number when I get to Alnugo. I'll call you then." Earl handed her his number without hesitation, though he knew that if he really did apply to Alnugo University, he would likely change his number as well. As for whether they would meet again, well, that was up to fate. Bianca carefully wrote down his number. After a moment of thought, she looked up and said earnestly, "Promise me this. Make sure you get into Alnugo University." "I will," Earl replied with a confident nod. At that moment, Bianca found herself captivated by Earl's unwavering gaze. His confidence shone like the stars, and for the first time, she saw a new side of him, one that made her heart skip a beat. "Are you disappointed that Faye rejected you today?" Bianca suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Earl said nonchalantly, "Not really. I expected it. Since I was bold enough to confess, I wasn't afraid of rejection." Bianca studied him carefully and found that his expression remained calm. Indeed, there was no sign of dejection after Faye's refusal. What she saw instead was a quiet confidence and an unwavering hope for the future. Bianca sighed softly, feeling a twinge of regret for Earl's rejection. Putting aside family background and academic achievements, Earl truly was a great person. But she also understood Faye's decision. The future was full of uncertainties, and high school romances were inherently fragile. More importantly, their family backgrounds belonged to entirely different worlds. In this diverse and open society, many encourage the idea of love without barriers, but reality painted a harsher picture. Unions between vastly different social classes often ended in tragedy. Faye studied under Donald, and her future seemed destined for brilliance. Meanwhile, Earl was still fighting to secure a spot at college. If nothing miraculous happened, their paths would diverge irreparably. When Earl had chosen to confess, the outcome had already been decided. As these thoughts ran through her mind, Bianca felt a subtle sadness welling up in her heart. "Earl, you sang Time so beautifully," Bianca said, bringing the conversation back to the song Earl had performed earlier. It was a song she liked too. Earl smiled modestly. "Thank you for the compliment. I really liked that song." Bianca stared at him intently, her voice carrying a hint of disbelief. "Are you sure that song wasn't written or sung by you?" Under Bianca's expectant gaze, Earl hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. No, it wasn't me. Disappointment flashed across Bianca's face. If Earl had truly written or performed that song, it would have been remarkable. To compose a tune that had spread across the country and was destined to become a classic, such talent would make anyone's heart skip a beat. But alas, time passed in silence until their clothes were finally dry. To avoid further awkwardness, both of them quickly put their garments back on. Suddenly, lights appeared on the river, accompanied by the rhythmic sounds of oars and distant voices calling out. Earl squinted into the darkness. A group of classmates had taken boats and were searching along the river. Earl shouted, waving his arms near the fire. Over here, we're okay. Bianca joined in, jumping up and down. The boats adjusted the course and headed in their direction. On the lead boat, a group of classmates stood at the bow, with Wenzel and Ernesto at the forefront. When they saw Earl and Bianca standing safely on the shore, they broke into cheers. Some of the girls even cried tears of joy. The group had feared the worst for Earl and Bianca. Seeing them alive and well was nothing short of a miracle. Once ashore, the classmates jumped off the boats, swarming around Earl and Bianca with hugs and a barrage of questions about what had happened. Bianca glanced at Earl, her cheeks flushing slightly. Earl saved me, she said softly. Gasps and exclamations erupted all around. Every eye turned to Earl, their gazes filled with admiration. Words of praise and awe echoed from every corner. Wenzel punched Earl lightly on the chest, his voice filled with astonishment. Holy crap, Earl, you're a legend. You're our hero. The image of Earl diving into the river to save Bianca, without a moment's hesitation, replayed vividly in everyone's minds. They had feared that Earl, too, might have drowned. No one could have imagined that he would pull off such a daring and selfless act. Not only had he survived, but he had also managed to save Bianca. It was insanely cool. Meanwhile, Bianca was surrounded by the girls, who were checking on her and fussing over her well-being. Though the ordeal had been terrifying, the relief of a happy ending erased all traces of fear. As night fell, the group decided to end the gathering. No one was in the mood to continue celebrating after such an eventful day. After bidding their farewells, the party quietly disbanded. With the college entrance exam results looming, the group scattered, each going their separate ways, chasing their futures. For Earl and his peers, the end of the exams marked the beginning of a carefree summer. Over the next month, as they waited for the results, Earl, Wenzel, and Ernesto spent their days indulging in the simple joys of life. They fished by the river, played games at cyber cafes, and even played a few rounds of billiards. Chapter 12. Earl discovered that after developing his super brain, not only had his songwriting and composing skills skyrocketed, but his gaming abilities had also become downright terrifying. Recently, a real-time strategy game called Skybound Wars had taken the world by storm. Developed by the global powerhouse Stormspire Interactive, it was the hottest game on the planet. All the major gaming tournaments, both domestic and international, were dominated by Skybound Wars, cementing its status as the undisputed king of competitive gaming. Wenzel and Ernesto were utterly obsessed with the game, and Earl had recently joined in. At first, Wenzel and Ernesto had a field day bullying Earl in matches, easily crushing him. But after just 2 days, Earl had caught up to their level. By the end of the week, Earl was on a completely different level. With just one hand, he could annihilate both Wenzel and Ernesto in a 2-on-1 match. One morning, after finishing breakfast, Wenzel and Ernesto dragged Earl to the Skyburst Gaming Cafe. Wenzel, you've gotta help me out. Some young punks are here to cause trouble, a cafe attendant approached Wenzel, his face full of desperation. Earl had only been playing Skybound Wars for a short time, but Wenzel was a regular at Skyburst Gaming Cafe and had earned a solid reputation in the Skybound Wars community. His skills ranked among the best. The cafe often hosted Skybound Wars challenges, and Wenzel was usually one of the players defending its honor whenever challengers showed up. Seeing the cafe attendant's plea for help, Wenzel readily agreed without hesitation. He immediately grabbed Ernesto and Earl, and the three of them headed over. The attendant glanced toward a row of high NPCs. They've already taken their seats. 4 of them are set to play, and there are two more standing behind them, probably their backup. To Earl's surprise, the four opponents sitting across from him were all quite striking, not just in appearance, but also in their demeanor. At the center sat a young man who exuded an air of calm, yet there was a maturity about him that seemed beyond his years. There was a hint of arrogance in his brows, and whenever others spoke to him, their faces carried a subtle trace of deference. Next to him was a chubby guy, whose greasy appearance and oversized frame were so unappealing that Earl's gaze skipped over him entirely. Earl couldn't muster the slightest interest in looking his way. However, what truly caught Earl's attention were the two stunning women seated beside the guys. On the left was a haughty girl whose beauty was undeniable but accompanied by an overbearing arrogance. She seemed to flaunt her good looks and likely privileged background with an air so condescending it felt as though her nose was perpetually pointed at the sky. But it was the other girl who truly intrigued Earl. Her appearance was wild, almost absurdly so. She sported an enormous, fiery red afro that looked like a bomb had gone off on her head. A lollipop dangled from her lips like a cigarette, and to top it off, she even had tattoos. But none of these eccentricities could overshadow her striking beauty. For Earl, Bianca and Faye had already set a high standard for beauty. Bianca was like a secluded orchid in a quiet valley, exuding an ethereal and independent grace, while Faye had a warm and friendly charm that made her naturally approachable. But this girl with the red hair was different. Her beauty was tinged with the allure of a mature woman, exuding a sensuality that carried a hint of dominance. It was mesmerizing. Earl found himself momentarily stunned as he stared. As for the Skyburst Gaming Cafe side, aside from two older men, there happened to be just two vacant seats. Wenzel and Ernesto quickly took them. Seeing there was no seat left for Earl, he casually said, "I'm going to the restroom. You guys go ahead and play." After using the restroom, Earl felt a bit thirsty and went to the counter to buy a few bottles of water. He then strolled leisurely around the cafe, taking his time. By the time he returned, both teams were already locked in an intense battle. Skybound Wars was somewhat reminiscent of classics like StarCraft or Age of Empires. The gameplay revolved around building up your base, amassing troops, and engaging in battles. However, its 3D graphics and intricate backstory added a layer of depth that made it far more engaging. At the moment, though, things weren't looking good for Wenzel and Ernesto. They were being utterly crushed by the four young challengers. In Skybound Wars, players could level up their forces to a total of 12 tiers. Reaching the maximum level made the player nearly invincible. However, in real matches, players rarely progressed beyond 3 or 4 tiers before engaging in battles, as opponents wouldn't allow you the time to reach the highest levels. Instead, games were often a mix of skirmishes and disruptions, with players reaching only levels 5 or 6 by the time one side was defeated. For now, Wenzel and Ernesto had only managed to upgrade their forces to level 2 when their opponents launched an all-out attack. Forced into a desperate battle, Wenzel's team had no choice but to fight tooth and nail. Wenzel, struggling with his slower reaction speed, couldn't spare any time to develop his resources further. Meanwhile, their opponents, who were clearly faster, managed to fight fiercely while simultaneously upgrading their forces. The most dangerous opponent was, surprisingly, the stunning girl with the fiery afro. Not only was her speed incredible, but her army was the strongest, and she even knew how to employ tactics. While engaging Wenzel and Ernesto head-on, she sent a detachment of troops to sneak around the back, laying traps and ambushes. She set Ernesto's base ablaze, forcing him to pull his troops back for defense, but only to fall into another ambush. His forces were surrounded and pummeled, leaving him nearly wiped out. When Ernesto finally recovered and turned his attention back to the girl, he looked at her as if he'd seen something scary. From that moment on, he avoided her troops whenever possible. By the time Wenzel's forces painfully climbed to level 3, their opponents were already at level 4. The afro-haired girl had even reached level 5, giving her an overwhelming advantage that crushed Wenzel's team. The outcome was predictable. Wenzel and Ernesto's nation was utterly annihilated. I thought Skyburst Gaming Cafe was supposed to be full of hidden experts. Turns out it's just a bunch of trash. The chubby guy sneered, puffing on his cigarette and letting out a cloud of smoke with exaggerated arrogance. Wenzel's face turned pale at the insult, but having lost so decisively, he couldn't find the words to argue. The afro-haired girl noticed Wenzel's unwillingness to accept defeat. Her bright eyes sparkled mischievously as she said in an innocent tone, "What's wrong? Did my brother say something that wasn't true?" The haughty girl next to her covered her mouth and let out a light laugh. As for the guy who seemed to be the leader, he remained silent the entire time, not even sparing Wenzel's group a glance. To him, Wenzel and the others were simply beneath notice. "That's the best of 5 rounds. Don't celebrate too soon," Wenzel snapped, his voice tinged with frustration. He then pointed at Earl. "We're switching players for the next match. He's up." The leader of the opposing group didn't even lift his eyes to acknowledge the change in players. However, the afro-haired girl glanced up at Earl, her gaze flickering with a hint of interest before she smirked, her tone dripping with disdain. "So you found another piece of trash for us to crush?" The haughty girl chimed in with equal sharpness. "Trash is still trash, no matter how much you pile it up." Ernesto stepped down, and Earl took his place. The battle began. When both sides reached level 2, the war broke out in full force. Earl, after familiarizing himself with the enemy's tactics just once, quickly grasped their patterns and began tapping furiously on the keyboard. Flanking reinforcements, creating diversions, bluffing strength, feigning weakness, luring enemies deep into traps, and executing strategic retreats to counterattack. Earl seamlessly executed 15 classic strategies of deception and warfare, weaving them into the gameplay like a master tactician. The opponents found themselves completely outmaneuvered, caught off guard at every turn, scrambling to respond. By the end, they were so rattled that they hesitated to make any move, as though every step they took would trigger another one of Earl's traps. The afro-haired girl, however, proved to be more capable than her teammates. Relying on her level 4 troops, she attempted to overwhelm Earl with brute force. But to her dismay, she discovered that Earl wasn't just a master of deception and strategy. His forces had quietly advanced to level 4 as well. Luring her troops into a trap, Earl launched a 2-pronged ambush. The afro-haired girl's forces were caught in a brutal pincer attack, unable to defend on either side. Under Earl's relentless and savage assault, her nation fell, and she was forced to endure the humiliation of utter defeat. Chapter 13. The afro-haired girl was the most formidable of the group. Once her troops were obliterated, the others had no resistance left, and Earl relentlessly pursued them, swiftly clearing them out. "This is not fair. You only won because of your tricks and schemes." The haughty girl stood up, her face flushed with anger. She believed Earl had only won through deception. The afro-haired girl also shot Earl a furious glare, clearly not accepting her defeat. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Skyburst Gaming Cafe was electric, with cheers and applause filling the air. Earl smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Try again, if you are not satisfied with the outcome," he said. The afro-haired girl's team put on their headphones, preparing for another round. This time, they knew Earl was a master of deception, so they played cautiously, constantly watching for tricks. But Earl had anticipated this, knowing they would treat him like a thief. He switched up his strategy, and once again, the classic strategies of deception and warfare proved to be a treasure trove of tactics. In this round, Earl employed a mix of clever tactics like misdirection to disguise his true intentions, feints to divert the enemy's attention, and subtle maneuvers to exploit hidden pathways. He also used provocations to force premature actions from them and used lures to draw powerful opponents away from key positions. Under this barrage of clever tactics, the poor enemy was left reeling and spinning in circles. By the end, they were so disoriented they started attacking their own teammates. This time, after losing, the opponents were too stunned to say anything. They knew Earl's deceptive nature and still couldn't win. It was an intellectual crushing defeat. Physical shortcomings such as height, weight, and hand speed could all be honed with practice. But there was no way to train anyone to outsmart someone like Earl. One more round. This time, we're switching players, the leader of the group, Zane Villarama, suddenly said. Zane added, "If you win this one, I'll call you Master today." Whatever you ask of me, I'll do it without question. The chubby guy was shocked. Zane, you. The two girls were equally stunned. Having grown up with Zane in the same neighborhood, they knew his pride well. But now, to acknowledge Earl as their superior and gamble on the outcome, it wasn't about any real loss, but the dignity he would lose in doing so was more important than anything else. Clearly, the two previous rounds had left Zane burning with frustration. Sure, Earl smiled slightly, confidence oozing from him. Leo, Timothy, you're up, Zane demanded. The new players were Leo Samara and Timothy Dalton, replacing the chubby guy and the haughty girl. It was obvious from their demeanor that they were no slouches, and the switch immediately made a noticeable difference. This time, the enemies changed their tactics. Instead of rushing to eliminate Earl, they focused on wiping out the three flanks before targeting Earl. Clearly, the two new players had professional-level skills, and Wenzel's team stood no chance. Damn, Earl, help us. They're about to wipe us out. Wenzel yelled in frustration. Help me, my base is gone. One of them screamed in panic. Ah, my clans. How did they level it with cannons? Another yelled, his voice filled with disbelief. But in front of Earl, they were still no match. As their forces surrounded Earl the freak, calmly revealed his quietly developed level 5 army and crushed them under his might. It was at that moment they realized how utterly pathetic they were in the face of overwhelming strength. You're insane, Wenzel exclaimed, watching Earl effortlessly wielding his army like a sword, cutting down enemies with a grace that made him want to bow down in reverence. And it only got worse. After repelling the enemy, Earl wasn't in a rush to strike them down. Instead, he focused on rapidly advancing his technology, intending to max out his army and use the nuclear bombs to bring peace to enemy's clan. The enemies seemed to have caught on to Earl's plan, desperately attempting to harass him. But every time they organized a coalition, Earl's brutal forces shattered them. They couldn't win the fight, yet they couldn't overpower Earl in the battle. And what was worse was that their development was lagging behind. They knew they were going to lose, but Earl wasn't in a hurry to kill them. Instead, Earl aimed to torment them, play with them, and completely crush them. It was a kind of torture that made the afro-haired girl and Zane Villarama feel like they were in hell. Finally, when the enemy's forces reached level 8, Earl reached the max level of 12. In Earl's clan, the skies were filled with massive spacecraft, the seas with enormous aircraft carriers and submarines, and the land was dominated by towering steel fortresses and endless world wonders. And then came the onslaught, like a hurricane, devastating everything in its path. The enemy was crushed into dust. When the final guided weapon launched, releasing a nuclear bomb with an explosive yield of billions, it nearly obliterated the entire map. The enemies were reduced to nothing. When the nuclear explosion erupted, Earl had named it World Emperor. The scene was so intense it felt like the computer's graphics card might burn out. Those watching were left in stunned silence. This kind of overwhelming abuse was downright savage. Earl was unbelievably ruthless, almost inhuman at this point. Impossible, how could we lose? One of the opponents muttered. The two backup players, still stunned, were in disbelief. What they didn't know was that one of the players, Timothy Dalton, was a professional Skybound Wars player, among the best in the city. He'd been invited by Zane to help out for fun, never expecting to be so thoroughly dominated by Earl. In fact, Earl's skills were good enough to enter the professional scene. After the enemies were crushed, Earl turned his gaze to Zane. Now, Zane, call me Master. The afro-haired girl and the others all turned to look at Zane. The haughty girl wanted to defend him, but when she thought about Earl's domineering and brutal sweep of the battlefield earlier, there was nothing to criticize. She could only shut her mouth, fuming with frustration. Master, Zane muttered, his face filled with humiliation and resentment. Remember, from now on, you'll have to call me Master whenever you see me. Understand, Earl said with a teasing grin. Zane gritted his teeth in anger, but there was no rebuttal he could offer. Earl enjoyed the moment but didn't press the mockery further. He gave a casual wave and stood up, heading toward the pool hall. Damn, Earl, that was amazing. You were incredible today. I'm so impressed. Wenzel and Ernesto followed Earl closely, their faces full of flattery. The three of them arrived at the pool table to unwind after being cooped up in front of the computer for so long. Suddenly, the door to the pool hall opened, and a group of good-looking men and appealing women walked in. Wenzel's eyes brightened. Hey, it's Faye. Sure enough, Faye was among them. Although Faye was undoubtedly the most dazzling among the group, the rest of them had an elegant aura. The men were mostly very handsome, and the women were all stunningly beautiful with fair skin, turning heads wherever they went. A few of them even carried guitars or violins on their backs, probably fellow musicians like Faye. Hi Faye, what brings you here? Ernesto called out from a distance. Having a friend like Faye was definitely something to be proud of. Faye flashed a sweet smile. They are my seniors. They're visiting Perth City, and I'm just keeping them company. She then turned her gaze to Earl and Wenzel, hesitated for a moment, and nodded slightly, offering a brief greeting. Although they had been childhood friends, ever since Earl's confession had been rejected, an invisible barrier had formed between Faye and him. Faye, these are your friends? One of the men asked with a haughty tone. Yes. Faye nodded, considering how best to introduce her friends. They're all my high school classmates. After a moment, she felt a little embarrassed and added, this is Earl. He has an amazing voice. Really? The good-looking guy gave Earl a casual glance, his eyes sweeping over him. He then let out a slight, dismissive chuckle. Chapter 14. Seeing the dismissive look from the good-looking guy, Faye felt a little embarrassed. After all, her friends weren't exactly high class, which indirectly suggested that her circle wasn't all that impressive. Although Faye wasn't as worldly as someone who had already experienced the realities of adult life, she still cared about her image. As a result, her expression became a little colder when facing Earl, Wenzel, and Ernesto. She had no intention of introducing the group to Earl. However, two of the girls, who were not bad-looking, began to study Earl. They seemed quite intrigued, with one saying, "Is he really a good singer? He looks pretty handsome. Look at his eyes," the other girl added with a giggle. "They're so captivating. Faye, come on, introduce him to us," they urged. Faye had no intention of making the introduction. Earl, noticing how the group seemed to look down on him, decided to just ignore them. Wenzel and Ernesto found a table and started playing pool. Earl picked up a cue stick and sat on the side, watching them play. Earl was great at pool, far above the level of Wenzel and Ernesto. Most of the time, it was just Wenzel and Ernesto, two amateurs, going back and forth, while Earl acted as the referee. Meanwhile, over at Faye's table, the good-looking guy displayed impressive skills in pool. The rest of the group played against him, but within just a few rounds, they were thoroughly beaten. Feeling a bit lonely from his overwhelming dominance, the guy adopted an air of superiority, sitting off to the side, sipping on a drink with a smug look on his face. Faye noticed Seth Wood, the good-looking guy, seemed bored and eager to impress. She turned to Wenzel and Ernesto, who were still playing pool, and said, "Ernesto, Wenzel, how about you two play a couple of rounds with Seth?" Wenzel and Ernesto exchanged a glance. Though they weren't fond of the group, they didn't want to disappoint Faye. All right, they agreed. Seth, however, put on an air of superiority. He didn't even move until Wenzel and Ernesto walked over. He slowly stood up and gave them a disdainful glance. "Faye, I can't be bothered to play if they are amateurs." His words implied he thought little of them. A shorter guy standing nearby explained, "Seth doesn't just play with anyone." Faye's face flushed with embarrassment. She turned to Wenzel and asked in a soft voice, "Wenzel, are you good at playing pool?" She was worried she'd chosen two worthless players. The question made Wenzel and Ernesto's faces darken. They were upset by the implication but, seeing Faye's slightly pleading expression, Wenzel reluctantly replied, "We're all right." Seth, not missing a beat, spoke up again. "How about we make it interesting? Let's add a little wager to the game, that's what makes it fun." Wenzel and Ernesto exchanged uneasy looks. "What do you have in mind?" Wenzel asked. Seth replied, "Let's play pool. $50 for a game. If you score over 80 in one shot, I'll double the stakes." For every 20 extra points, I'll double it again. What do you say? Wenzel and Ernesto hesitated when Seth suggested a wager. Neither of them came from wealthy families, and the prospect of losing money made them nervous. Seth noticed their hesitation and sneered. Can't afford to play. Fine, then. But Faye, your social circle is low. Don't tell me you used to hang out with these guys. Faye's face turned pale. She felt utterly humiliated. All right, let's do it, Wenzel said, squeezing the cash in his pocket. He reluctantly agreed, his pride stung. He didn't want to be seen as weak, especially not in front of someone as beautiful as Faye. He had $200 in his pocket, so he figured it'd be enough for 2 rounds. Sure enough, after 3 rounds, Wenzel nearly lost everything, including his dignity. Feeling embarrassed, he quietly asked Ernesto for help. Ernesto, why don't you take over for a couple of rounds? Ernesto hesitated, counting the $180 in his pocket. With no choice, he agreed. In 2 rounds, Ernesto made one shot worth 80 points, leaving him with just $30. He dared not go back for a 3rd round. Seth taunted, counting the dollars in his hand. If you're out of cash, go home and get some. I'm giving you a chance to win back what you lost. You know what they say, if you don't double down when you can, you're dumber than a pig. Loud, mocking laughs from Seth's group echoed around the room. Seth was deliberately trying to provoke them. It was clear to everyone that continuing would only lead to Wenzel and Ernesto losing even more. But if they didn't at least try to get their money back, they would look like fools. Wenzel was infuriated by Seth's subtle insult, but he felt too guilty to retort. Suddenly, Earl said, I'll do it. I actually have some money on me. Quote, Earl hadn't wanted to get involved, but now that his friends were in a tough spot, he couldn't just stand by. Wenzel and Ernesto exchanged a hopeful glance, knowing Earl's skills were way better than theirs. He might just be able to get them back on track. But there was one problem. Earl was the poorest of the 3. How much money could he possibly have? If he lost, they'd be in deep trouble. Faye frowned slightly, uncertain about Earl's decision. However, the girls behind her seemed more excited. A girl with a ponytail leaned toward Faye and said, Faye, how good is this guy at pool? He looks pretty strong. Faye shrugged. I'm not really sure, but he seems pretty average. The ponytailed girl grinned. Who cares? He's handsome, that's all that matters. Seth gave Earl a once-over, his gaze full of arrogance. All right, let's get started. You know the rules, right? Deep down, Seth was wondering if Earl even had the money to pay if he lost. Earl replied, got it. But I think we should tweak the rules a little bit. He casually pulled out a wallet from his pocket and fished out some bills. He asked, how about we make it $100 a game? And starting from 60, every 10 points will double the bet. Does that sound good? The group gasped. 80 points were tough to hit, but 60 was still doable for skilled players. Given Seth's earlier performance, it almost seemed like Earl was handing him money on a silver platter. Even the ponytailed girl couldn't resist nudging Faye. This guy must be loaded, right? Faye furrowed her brows slightly and shook her head. The ponytail girl wasn't sure what Faye's gesture meant. Was it a no, or was she saying that Earl didn't have money? Wenzel and Ernesto were left stunned. They had no idea where Earl had come up with this much money. They knew his family situation well, and playing this big was risky. What if they lost? Wenzel subtly tugged at Earl, trying to signal him to take it easy. But Earl just shrugged him off, unaffected. The truth was, Earl had a little over $1,000 in his wallet. That was the money he'd saved from part-time work and the promise of a stable future. The money wasn't just for fun. He had plans to buy programming and finance study materials, or maybe a better guitar. But today, he decided to bet it all. Seth's eyes widened, greed flashing through them. All right, Seth said, though his tone was a bit forced. Inside, he was worried that Earl might back out. Earl shook his head. If the bet is too little, it won't be fun. All right then, no more talking. Let's start the game. If I win, I'm treating everyone to late-night snacks tonight, Seth said. Seth suppressed his excitement. thinking to himself that it was foolish to turn down free money when it was practically being handed to him. Chapter 15. The game began. Seth took the first shot, his movements confident and practiced. Then, it was Earl's turn. Seth's skills were undeniably impressive. He had received professional billiards training as a child and even considered pursuing a career in pool before his passion for music took over. Even now, despite being a hobbyist, his level was leagues above the average player. When Seth missed a shot, it was Earl's turn. Earl's stance was striking. It was standard yet graceful, exuding a unique aura. Each time his cue connected with the ball, the crisp sound was followed by the satisfying sight of the target ball sinking into the pocket. The girls who had initially cheered for Seth couldn't help but admire Earl's performance. Quiet murmurs of approval spread among them. To their surprise, they found themselves rooting for Earl to win. The first round ended with Earl losing, though by an incredibly narrow margin. He calmly pulled out $100 and handed it to Seth. Wenzel tugged at Earl's sleeve and whispered for him to let it go, but Earl shook his head silently, refusing to say a word. In the second round, after adapting to Seth's playstyle and familiarizing himself with the table, Earl began to shine. He won the second game with a spectacular 60-point streak, pocketing $200. In the third, he scored 80 points, earning him $400. By the fourth, Earl's precision reached new heights. He scored 100 points and won $800. And in the fifth round, Earl pulled off a jaw-dropping 120-point streak, bringing in a massive $1,600. The onlookers were stunned, their expressions shifting to one of awe and disbelief. Earl's performance was nothing short of monstrous, his dominance on the table utterly terrifying. One of Seth's companions, a short man with shifty eyes, couldn't hold back his frustration. With a sneer, he barked, not happy about it. Then, come at me. Let's see if you've got what it takes before I break your legs. Earl was about to lash out when the cyber cafe's main door swung open. The group that had been playing Skybound Wars, led by a tall guy and an afro-haired girl, stepped out. As soon as Seth caught sight of them, his eyes lit up, and he immediately forgot all about Earl. He dashed over with a fawning grin plastered on his face. Hi, Zane, what brings you here? If you're out having fun, why not call me? I'm bored to death at home, he said eagerly, practically wagging his tail. Seth turned to the afro-haired girl and her friends, quickly throwing out greetings with a servile enthusiasm that bordered on embarrassing. The onlookers who knew Seth stared, utterly stunned by his sudden display. And when they realized he was sucking up to Zane, they were even more astonished. Some in the crowd knew who Zane was. And more importantly, what kind of influence he wielded. To them, Zane was the kind of person who existed in a stratosphere that they could never hope to reach. Yet, here Seth was, chatting him up. Even if he came off as desperate, it was still enough to prove the breadth of Seth's connections. The girls nearby couldn't help whispering among themselves, planning how they might use Seth to get an introduction to Zane. Zane's gaze landed on Earl, his expression darkening as he asked, "What's going on here?" Seth sneered. "I ran into a few clowns who thought they were tough. His dad is just a farmer, and he had the nerve to set me up just now. I was just about to teach him a lesson." The short guy chimed in, eager to please, "Yeah, Zane. Why don't you show them how it's done?" Everyone knew Zane had a taste for fights, so the short guy jumped at the chance to flatter him. Earl was unfazed, and he asked coldly, "Are you all done talking? You're still running your mouth." Seth barked, motioning to the group. A dozen guys closed in around Earl. The girls screamed in panic, while Faye grabbed Seth's sleeve, trying to pull him back. "Don't do this," she pleaded, but Seth brushed her off impatiently. "Stay out of this. This is men's business." Zane, lighting a cigarette, smirked and leaned back, clearly ready to enjoy the show as Earl got beaten to a pulp. Earl said suddenly, his voice low and dangerous, "Zane, have you forgotten about our little agreement already?" Zane froze. He stared at Earl, whose cold, piercing eyes were filled with a terrifying intensity. A flash of memory hit Zane like a thunderbolt, and his face shifted through several shades of pale. He threw the cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his heel. Lowering his head slightly, he muttered, "Master." Though his voice was low, it cut through the tension like a blade. That single word landed like a thunderclap in the silent crowd. Zane, someone from a prominent family, a top-tier player in their social scene, and a powerhouse in his own right, was calling Earl, "Master." Seth and the short guy stood frozen, their mouths hanging open wide enough to swallow a whole egg. They couldn't believe their ears. The girls, who moments ago were fawning over Zane, were now trembling, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Who was Earl, really? And what kind of power did he hold over someone like Zane? It was as if two worlds, one elite and untouchable, the other mundane and insignificant, had collided in the most incomprehensible way, let alone Zane addressing Earl, the farmer, as "Master." To Zane and the short guy, the shock was bone-chilling, like stumbling upon a horror movie scene in the middle of nowhere at midnight. Earl seemed satisfied with Zane's obedience, but his irritation toward Zane's earlier arrogance hadn't subsided. With a sharp glance, Earl said, "Since you're calling me Master, you should know what to do next, right?" A flicker of humiliation passed through Zane's eyes, but he clenched his fists and suddenly swung a punch straight into Seth's face. Seth yelped, caught completely off guard. Staggering back, he shouted, "Zane, why the hell are you hitting me?" "Because your mouth stinks. Who else deserves it if it's not you?" Zane snapped, his frustration from Earl's earlier reprimand spilling over as he used Seth as a punching bag. The short guy, trembling, asked cautiously, "What's going on, Zane? Why are you?" He had originally intended to flatter Zane, but unexpectedly, his attempt had backfired. The punch Seth received felt unfair. Neil Gavinia, the chubby guy who was with Zane, kicked the short guy. "Get lost. Did Zane ask for you?" The short guy tumbled to the ground, too scared to speak up. The few girls who were watching were dumbfounded. Their expressions shifted from disdain to awe. To be called "Master" by Zane. Just who was this person? The so-called farmer's son now seemed to have a mysterious air about him. After all, even the city's top officials would show respect when meeting Zane. Faye was confused by what was happening too. Earl being called "Master" by Zane was beyond her expectations. Her mind was struggling to catch up. Zane and Neil were going at it fiercely, while Seth and the short guy could only cry for mercy, not daring to fight back. The only thing they could do was scramble to get away. Unable to watch any longer, Faye stepped forward and whispered to Earl, "Earl, you should tell them to stop. If this keeps up, someone might get seriously hurt." Although Faye didn't understand why Zane and Neil were backing down to Earl, she knew that Earl didn't come from a wealthy background. If something happened to Seth, Earl would likely be held accountable, and it could ruin him. Earl decided to call it off. "All right. No more fighting," he demanded. After Zane and Neil stopped, Seth and the short guy were both battered beyond recognition, barely able to be identified. The two of them were undoubtedly regretting their actions, realizing they had provoked someone they should not have messed with. What followed was completely beyond their expectations. After Zane and Neil had given Seth and the short guy a good beating, Zane turned to Earl with a slightly sarcastic tone. "Master, are you happy now?" Chapter 16. I'm quite satisfied. You did well, but next time, make sure to hit them harder. Otherwise, it'll seem like you've missed a meal, Earl said casually. Neil shot a cold glare at Earl, and the afro-haired girl along with the haughty girl both cast contemptuous looks at him, clearly unimpressed by Earl's act of bluffing. But Earl couldn't care less. Once everything had settled, Zane walked over to Seth, pointing a finger at his nose as he scolded, "Remember this. Keep your eyes open from now on, or I'll end you." "Yes, you're right. I won't do it again," Seth said submissively, his earlier defiance completely wiped out by the beating. He now appeared meek and obedient. Zane snorted, still harboring some resentment towards Earl. He didn't even bother to greet him before walking off. With nothing more to stay for, Earl decided to leave as well, taking Ernesto and Wenzel with him. Faye and the others had no idea what kind of relationship Earl and Zane had. As they saw them leaving, they didn't dare stop them, their faces full of confusion and uncertainty. Ernesto and Wenzel were in awe of Earl. The scene had been so intense and thrilling. To see Earl turn things around was truly impressive. They knew that if Zane had refused to back down, their situation would have been disastrous. They had seen how vicious Zane and Neil could be. Seth had been beaten into an unrecognizable mess. If it had been them in his place, they wouldn't have stood a chance. Yet, thinking back on how badly Seth had been beaten, a sense of satisfaction lingered. After leaving the entertainment hall, the three of them were discussing what had just happened when Earl suddenly remembered his jacket was still in the pool hall. He told Ernesto and Wenzel to head back without him and turned to retrieve his jacket. When he entered the pool hall, Earl grabbed his jacket and was just about to head out when he suddenly heard a roar coming from a corner. "Don't touch them. If you want to fight, come at me." Earl recognized the voice. It was Zane. He walked toward the sound and, sure enough, found Zane and his group surrounded by a group of young men who looked like trouble. The situation didn't look good. One of the thugs, a fierce-looking guy with a buzz cut, holding a sharp knife in his hand, sneered and threatened, "You've got some guts, huh? Too bad someone gave us orders. Today, none of you are getting out." The group of thugs numbered more than 10, surrounding Zane and the others with no way to escape. Although Zane and his companions were from wealthy backgrounds and seemed experienced, they couldn't help but feel a sense of fear in the face of this kind of danger. "What's going on here?" A loud, commanding voice rang out, and Earl stepped forward. Although Earl didn't think much of Zane and his crew, since Zane had kept his promise, he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. After all, Earl had earned that master title, so he might as well step up. The buzz-cut thug scowled and snapped, "Who the hell are you to challenge me? You've got a death wish." Two of his lackeys immediately stepped forward, blocking Earl's path, trying to prevent him from getting any closer. Zane and the others watched in shock, unable to believe that this seemingly ordinary young man was actually stepping in to help. Neil sneered, "Get out of here. This has nothing to do with you." Although they were surrounded, they didn't want the son of a farmer to come to their rescue. It was just a casual, master, title earlier. Did he actually think he was a master now? Earl spoke calmly, "As your master, I can't just stand by when my underlings are in trouble. Otherwise, who's going to respect me?" The afro-haired girl scoffed. "You really think you're a master just because we called you one? Do you even know what you are dealing with?" Yet, for some strange reason, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of respect for Earl. The buzz-cut thug was further enraged by Earl's arrogance. He growled, "Fine, I'll make you kneel and sing for me today. Get him." With a flurry of noise and a cloud of dust, the sound of a triumphant song rang out. "Every night in my dreams, I see you, I feel you." The once cocky buzz-cut thug now found himself kneeling on the ground, lined up with his underlings, looking utterly ridiculous. Their expression was one of total humiliation, especially that of the buzz-cut thug, who had been beaten so badly that his face was swollen. It almost seemed like he was going to cry too. Earl pulled off his shoe and slapped the thug's face hard. "Sing louder. Let me hear you." The buzz-cut thug whimpered in pain. "Every night in my dreams." Zane, Neil, Leo, the afro-haired girl, and the others all stared wide-eyed, their faces full of disbelief as they watched Earl. The scene of Earl fiercely smacking the buzz-cut thug brought to mind a famous line from a movie. "I'll take on 10. It seemed that this guy not only outsmarted them, but his violent tactics completely outclassed theirs. If Zane hadn't stepped in earlier, Seth and the others would have been in an even worse position. After Earl finished giving them a harsh lesson, he gave the buzz-cut thug a hard kick in the rear. The thug flew through the air like a kite with its string cut, and, with the help of his underlings, he awkwardly scrambled away. Earl clapped his hands and casually said, "You're safe now." Zane and the others finally snapped back to reality, expressing their gratitude. "Thank you. You've certainly exceeded my expectations," Zane said. Neil, ever the one to swallow his pride, added, "I apologize for what I said earlier." Leo, visibly excited, spoke up, "Earl, I admire you so much. Can you teach me how to take on 10 people at once too?" Earl shook his head. "It's nothing special. Otherwise, how would I be your master?" For once, Zane didn't get angry at Earl's remark. Instead, he calmly said, "Let's be friends, shall we?" It was the first time he genuinely wanted to make a friend out of someone from a humble farming background. However, Earl looked at Zane's outstretched hand and shook his head. "Forget it. Let's part ways here." Without another word, he turned and walked away, catching up with Ernesto and Wenzel. Once Earl had left, Mona Warren, the haughty girl, spoke up. Her tone was filled with resentment. She sneered, "What's so impressive about him? He's just the son of a farmer. He doesn't even know his own worth. Does he think that just because he can fight, he's special and can be part of our team? Dream on." Zane gave her a soft reprimand, his voice calm but stern. "Mona, keep it down." Mona froze, trembling at the command, and immediately fell silent. Meanwhile, Zane and Neil, for the first time, began to understand why Earl had so easily turned down their offer of friendship. From Earl's actions, it was clear that he was a smart, independent young man with his own sense of pride. It was his self-awareness that made him realize the insurmountable gap between himself and people like Zane. Too many people had tried to climb up and blend into their circle, only to end up humiliated. After all, circles like theirs were largely built on mutual benefit and the exchange of interests. Earl, with his integrity and pride, couldn't make those kinds of exchanges of interest. He had nothing of value to offer Zane and the others, and forcing a friendship would only end in disappointment. Chapter 17. The long summer of waiting seemed to drag on, and the events that took place at Skyburst Gaming Cafe seemed to merely be an interlude in life. While Earl was waiting for his college entrance exam results, his song, "Time," soared like a rocket, breaking into the top 3 of the Billboard Hot 100 chart. This achievement quickly made him one of the most talked about rising stars in the music industry. Countless music legends turned their attention to the up-and-coming artist, curious to see whether this campus folk singer could continue to work his magic. However, just as "Time" was attempting to climb further up the charts, it met stiff competition from 2 classic songs holding firmly at the top. These 2 tracks seemed to have been revived with new energy, with their downloads and streams skyrocketing, leaving "Time" with no room to overtake. Though many sharp-eyed listeners suspected foul play with the chart manipulation, Earl couldn't have cared less. As the day for the college entrance exam results drew near, Earl decided to use the $7,000 or $8,000 he had earned from Seth to treat Wenzel and Ernesto to a meal. After that, he signed up for computer courses and even started to consider finding a part-time job to ease his family's financial burden. The place where Earl enrolled to learn computer skills was called Future Tech Training, specializing in programming and IT. Many students who had failed their college entrance exams chose to study here in hopes of securing a good job in the future. The owner and instructor of the training center was named Patrick Mendoza, a senior at Alnugo University, who was immensely helpful to Earl in his studies. Earl showed an incredible talent for technology and, combined with his hard work, he quickly became one of the top students in the class. Recognizing Earl's potential, Patrick directly invited him to participate in some of his side projects. In return, Patrick offered Earl a share of the profits. It turned out that Patrick ran a cheat software business on the side, which brought in a significant income. Earl eagerly accepted the offer. After all, it was a chance to improve his practical skills while also earning some money. What could be better than that? Then, the long-awaited day finally arrived. The college entrance exam results would finally be released. The temperature that day soared to 38 degrees Celsius, the sweltering heat making it hard to breathe. But the scorching weather couldn't dampen the enthusiasm of the graduates eager to check their results. Earl and his friends arrived at the cyber cafe, which was packed with people, many of whom were there to check their scores. Every so often, the air was filled with the sounds of cheers, screams, anger, or disappointment as students received their results. After a long wait, the 3 finally found an empty slot. They quickly input their account details and eagerly pressed the enter key. But to their dismay, the screen was filled with nothing but jumbled characters. It turned out that the website had crashed due to the overwhelming traffic from students checking their scores. The 3 had no choice but to keep entering their details and wait patiently. After what felt like an eternity, Wenzel was finally able to log in. His scores were displayed on the screen. Foreign language, 109. Math, 125. English, 90. Science, 241. Wenzel jumped up in excitement when he saw the results. Earl and Ernesto couldn't help but share his joy. Wenzel, who had been hovering around a total score of 520, had managed to score an unexpected 565 this time. Last year, the cutoff for first-tier universities had been 520, and now, Wenzel had not only passed the threshold but was also in a strong position to attend a prestigious university. Ernesto looked at Wenzel with envy and said, "I wonder how many points I'll get." "Wow, my results are out too." He quickly checked and exclaimed, "Foreign language, 90, math, 126, English, 95, and science, 230. The total is 540. For Ernesto, this was an average performance. With a bit of luck, he might even be able to reach the cutoff for top universities. Wenzel and Ernesto let out a sigh of relief before turning their attention to Earl, who was still trying to refresh his page. Unfortunately, all he was getting was a screen full of gibberish. At that moment, Wenzel and Ernesto's phones rang. It was a call from home, urging them to hurry back and report their results. Wenzel patted Earl on the shoulder and smiled, "Good luck. We're heading back now. Don't forget to let us know when you get your results." A moment later, two young, attractive girls took the seats Wenzel and Ernesto had vacated. They, too, began checking their scores and clearly had much better luck than Earl. While Earl was still stuck on a page of gibberish, he overheard a loud exclamation from the girls next to him. "Wow, Belle, you're amazing. You scored 682. A voice exclaimed in awe. The shout immediately drew everyone's attention. People around them began murmuring with envy. "Oh my God, 682 points. She even got 146 in English. Wow, I'd kill for that score." Someone gasped, clearly impressed. With this score, she could apply to any of the top 10 universities in the country without any problem. Another voice added, filled with admiration. "Wow, that's a really high score." Someone else muttered, their tone tinged with envy. Surrounded by admiration, the girl couldn't help but show a hint of pride. But Earl remained completely unaffected. He glanced at her score for a second before turning back to focus on refreshing his own results. The top student, noticing Earl's indifference, felt a bit annoyed. After all, seeing such a high score was a rare occurrence. He's probably just some loser. Even the system is ignoring him. It's been more than 10 minutes, and he still hasn't gotten his score, she thought to herself, and that helped ease her irritation. Meanwhile, Earl, with his bad luck, had become the subject of ridicule. One person laughed and said, "Look at this poor guy. He's been refreshing for half an hour and still hasn't gotten anything." Another chimed in, "I don't think he hasn't gotten his score. I bet he's too scared to check it. Probably didn't even score 200. No way. At least 250, I think," someone interjected, their voice laced with doubt. While people laughed and continued to fawn over Belle, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Only Belle and her friend remained, waiting for their results. Finally, Belle's friend's results came in. It was 520 points, a solid but unremarkable score. At that moment, Earl's computer screen suddenly lit up. His results were finally in. Foreign language, 138. Math, 150. Science, 293. English, 148. A total score of 729. What was even more eye-catching was the ranking displayed right after his score. Number 1 in the province. The top science student in Eastvale province had quietly emerged. In that moment, Earl's heart fluttered slightly with excitement. Finally, he had become the underdog of this year's college entrance exam, an unprecedented achievement that would not be surpassed. No matter how confident he had been before, seeing his results in black and white finally lifted the heavy burden on his shoulder. He walked out of the cyber cafe with light steps, as if the whole world were cheering for him. The top girl and her friend also noticed Earl's score. When they saw the remarkable score and ranking displayed on his screen, they couldn't help but rub their eyes in disbelief. Soon after, an exclamation rang out across the cyber cafe. Oh my god. Our state actually has a top scholar. It was as if a small pebble had been dropped into the quiet cyber cafe, sending ripples of shock and excitement through the room. At first, it was Belle's friend who heard her voice and curiously leaned over to take a look. Then, the others around them began to gather closer as well. Chapter 18. Soon, more people gathered, until nearly everyone in the cyber cafe was drawn in. At first, they whispered among themselves, then the chatter grew louder, until the entire room was buzzing. This guy is the top science student in the state. That's insane, one person exclaimed. Every year there are some serious contenders, but this one is something else, another muttered, shaking their head. I always thought of myself as a genius, but in front of someone like this, I'm happy to bow out, a third said with a resigned smile. This has to be someone from Crestfield High School. It looks like they'll have more to brag about this year, someone else added, glancing around at the others in agreement. The clamor in the cyber cafe was deafening, but it couldn't drown out the legend of Earl's achievement. Though the top girl, Belle had always been confident, there was no denying the vast gap between her status and Earl's legendary position. She was probably regretting how she had looked down on him earlier. But Earl, a person of such greatness, wouldn't care about someone like her, who was just another so-called top student. With a calm smile, Earl stepped out of the cyber cafe, hopped onto his bike, and rode toward the town, the sound of his bell ringing in the air. The flowers in the fields were in full bloom, and the willow fluff danced in the breeze, as if the world itself was heralding the beginning of Earl's brilliant life. He turned into an alley, where he saw Ernesto talking to a beautiful girl, none other than the stunning Faye. She was riding a pink bicycle and waved goodbye to Ernesto, saying, I'm planning to apply to Alnugo's School of Music. I'll be heading there for the summer tomorrow. With that, she left, her laughter like the sound of silver bells, fading away like a fleeting sunset. That moment of beauty, like the sunset on the horizon, was unforgettable. Ernesto noticed Earl coming and asked, How'd you do? Not bad, Earl replied, his voice calm and confident. Ernesto nodded, but since he was in a rush to get home, he didn't linger to talk further. Earl arrived home to see Jeffrey sitting at the door smoking a cigarette, Helena busy in the kitchen, and Joanne standing at the doorway, craning her neck in anticipation. The moment Joanne spotted Earl, her face lit up with joy as she called out, Earl is back. Jeffrey stood up quickly, and Helena rushed over from the kitchen. She asked anxiously as she grabbed Earl's arm, How did you do? What's your score? Can you at least make the minimum passing mark? 729, Earl replied calmly. Helena clapped her hands on her thighs and groaned, her face full of despair. Oh no, Earl, how could you only score that little? 279. How can 279 get you into college? It turned out that Helena had misheard Earl's score, thinking he had said 279 instead of 729. Jeffrey froze, his face mirroring Helena's expression. He assumed that Earl had only managed 279 points too. It was over. Everything was over. Luckily, Joanne's sharp ears picked up on the discrepancy. Her eyes widened in shock as she said, Wait. Earl, what did you say your score was? Earl kept his tone steady but deliberate. 729. First place in the entire state. He deliberately added his state ranking to ensure there was no misunderstanding this time. For Jeffrey and Helena, who had always been familiar with Earl's middling academic performance, this was a mind-blowing revelation. It was utterly beyond belief. Anyone who knew Earl would probably find this news utterly unbelievable too. Jeffrey stammered, What did you just say? Why, you're not joking, are you? Earl nodded firmly, his gaze steady. Joanne let out a squeal of delight and leapt into the air. Earl, you're amazing. You're my superstar. Jeffrey finally snapped out of his stupor. He gave Earl a solid pat on the shoulder and exclaimed, Good. That's perfect. You've made your dad proud. As he spoke, tears unknowingly welled up in Jeffrey's eyes. Helena was also overcome with emotion, tears streaming down her face. The four of them came together in a tight embrace, sharing this life-changing moment of joy and pride. But Earl's achievement wasn't destined to stay within the walls of their home. The incredible news was already starting to ripple outward, stirring waves of astonishment across their community. And the first person to feel the impact was none other than Marcus, Earl's homeroom teacher at Seton High School. While students were busy checking their results at cyber cafes, Marcus, the homeroom teacher at Seton High School, sat in his office manually entering the ID numbers of his students one by one to access their scores. The results were disheartening. The highest score he had seen so far was only 490, a score that was unlikely to meet the criteria for the prestigious first-tier universities. This also meant his bonus this year was likely to shrink significantly. Marcus furrowed his brows, his heart growing heavier with each passing moment. As he scrolled through the remaining list, the results only became more disappointing. When only a handful of names were left, a thought struck him. His eyes scanned the list until they landed on a familiar name, Earl. Without hesitation, Marcus entered Earl's ID and password. The numbers that appeared on the screen made Marcus freeze. He rubbed his eyes, staring at the screen to make sure he wasn't mistaken. After a moment of stunned silence, his heart raced so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. Marcus instinctively reached into his pocket for a cigarette to calm his nerves. But his hands trembled so much that it took several attempts to steady himself enough to light it. Puffing on his cigarette, he exhaled a plume of smoke and squinted at the screen again. Taking a few deep breaths, he tried to calm his excitement. To ensure he wasn't imagining things, he re-entered Earl's information multiple times. Each time, the same score appeared. A wave of euphoria surged through Marcus. It was real. Marcus recalled the time Earl had nearly hit 700 points in a mock exam. Back then, Marcus had suspected Earl of cheating. Who would have thought that the boy had been holding back all along? After finishing his cigarette, Marcus lit another one, this time savoring it like a well-earned reward. Top scholar, he whispered to himself, the words tasting sweeter with each repetition. The top scholar of the state. This was it, the stuff of legends. Marcus reveled in the thought of what this achievement would mean for him. The bonus, easily tens of thousands. A promotion, practically guaranteed. And then there was the impact on Seton High School. Marcus chuckled at the thought. In Perthter City, only Crestfield High School, with its storied 80-year history, had ever produced a top scholar. For a private school like Seton High to achieve such a feat, it would catapult their reputation to unparalleled heights. Marcus was excited. He grabbed his phone and called the school administrator to share the good news. However, Marcus was so overwhelmed with excitement that his explanation came out jumbled, making the school administrator think he was joking. Marcus repeated the details over and over, swearing on his life that it was true. Finally convinced, the administrator's disbelief turned into overwhelming joy that he fainted on the spot. At the same time, in Crestfield High School, Arthur, Earl's former homeroom teacher, sat in his own office, feeling immensely satisfied. He reviewed the scores of his current class, especially Bianca's impressive 688 points, which all but guaranteed her a spot as one of the state's top 2 students. Arthur leaned back in his chair, lighting a premium cigarette and sipping on freshly brewed tea. Thank goodness for my uncle, Shane Sayer, he muttered to himself, reflecting on how Shane's influence had landed him the prestigious role of teaching this class. With the bonuses coming in, Arthur couldn't help but smile at the fortune awaiting him. Just then, his phone buzzed. Glancing at the screen, he saw Shane's name. Chapter 19. On the other end of the line, Shane's voice carried a stern edge. Come to my office, he said curtly before hanging up. Arthur frowned in confusion. What could have gone wrong? He racked his brain, but he couldn't think of anything he might have done to offend Shane recently. Shrugging it off, he decided it was probably nothing serious. Humming a tune, he made his way to the principal's office at a leisurely pace. Knocking lightly on the door, he heard Shane's voice. Come in. Arthur stepped inside, only to find Shane sitting behind his desk, holding a teacup with a dark expression. His assistant, Jake Carter, was standing nearby, organizing documents in a tense silence. Arthur forced a smile and approached cautiously. Uncle Shane, what can I do for you? He asked, trying to sound casual. Shane set his teacup down with a sharp clink and fixed Arthur with a cold stare. In formal settings, don't call me Uncle Shane. I'm Principal Sayer here. There was a tightly controlled anger in Shane's voice, like a volcano teetering on the edge of eruption. Arthur's nerves began to fray. Ah, Principal Sayer, is there something wrong? He asked carefully. Shane opened a drawer and pulled out a notebook, tossing it onto the desk in front of Arthur. His expression grew darker. He asked, "Did you expel a student named Earl Hernandez from your class?" "He lives in the suburbs, and his phone number ends with 6789. Arthur felt a flicker of unease. Something about the situation felt off, but he couldn't figure out how Earl might be involved in any of this. He admitted hesitantly, "Yes. Why? What's going on?" Shane took a deep breath, clearly struggling to contain his anger. He gestured to Jake and said, "Jake, step outside for a moment. Shut the door behind you." Jake nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. He exited quickly, closing the door softly behind him. Once the office was left with just the two of them, Shane abruptly stood up and hurled his teacup at Arthur with all his strength. He shouted furiously, "Arthur, you shameless idiot. What the hell did I do in my past life to deserve this? You're nothing but a useless bastard. I swear, I'd break your damn legs if I could." Arthur barely dodged the cup, still getting clipped enough to leave him bruised. Clutching his head in confusion, he asked, "Uncle Shane, why are you so angry? I really don't know what's going on. Stop pretending to be clueless." Shane roared, pointing at a stack of documents scattered across the floor. "Look at that. Look at what you've done. You've completely ruined Crestfield High School's reputation for the next 20 years. Arthur was trembling. He bent down to pick up the papers. As he scanned the contents, his hands shook even harder. The documents listed the top 10 scorers in the state exams. His eyes landed on a name that made his heart nearly stop, Earl Hernandez. Next to it was a note that said, "Former student of Crestfield High School." Arthur froze, his mind reeling. His voice quivered as he stammered, This. Could it be, you damn fool," Shane bellowed, grinding his teeth with rage. He was practically shaking as he jabbed a finger toward Arthur. He snapped, "Do you have any idea what you've done? Crestfield High School spent 3 years nurturing a top scholar, and you expelled him. You handed him over to Seton High School on a silver platter. Do you even comprehend the damage this has done to the school? To my reputation. I should flay you alive. This can't be happening," Arthur muttered in denial. Shane, seeing Arthur's refusal to accept reality, picked up a chair and swung it at him. Arthur scrambled to dodge, his heart pounding in terror. By now, he knew he had completely messed up. Never in his wildest dreams could he have imagined that the student he expelled was this year's top science student in the state. It was like a bolt of lightning striking him out of nowhere. But Shane wasn't done. He grabbed a potted cactus from the desk and hurled it at Arthur. "Get out!" Shane roared, his voice booming through the office. "Get out of Crestfield High School and never come back." Arthur stumbled out of the office, battered and humiliated. His body ached, but his heart hurt even more. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Earl Hernandez, the same Earl who could barely scrape together a score of 300 or 400 in the past, had somehow transformed into the state's top scholar. It was a miracle. Arthur's mind spun. If Earl's achievement had remained under his purview, Arthur could have been looking at tens of thousands in bonuses, not to mention a probable promotion. But now, the bonus was gone. His career at Crestfield was likely over. The thought filled Arthur with bitter resentment. He couldn't figure out how that slacker, Earl, had pulled this off. There was only one explanation Arthur could cling to, cheating. But who would cheat their way to the top spot in the state? Dazed and furious, Arthur staggered out of the office. His legs gave way on the stairs, and he tumbled down in a heap. By the time he hit the bottom, his head was bleeding. The stars sparkled brightly, and the grass swayed gently in the breeze. It was a season destined to be one of abundance. In the undeveloped riverside suburbs, Earl, Wenzel, and Ernesto rode their bicycles, with the fishing nets in hand, weaving freely along the winding paths by the river. Their laughter echoed along the riverbank, blending seamlessly with the world around them. "What? You're the top scholar in the state." Wenzel's sudden shout broke the peaceful atmosphere, startling a chorus of frogs into croaking. Earl nodded calmly. Ernesto helped Wenzel out of the shallow pond he had stumbled into, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at Earl. The three had grown up together. It was shocking to them because they knew Earl so well, and the news felt like a surreal dream. Yet, miracles had a way of sneaking into life when one least expected them. After the initial shock wore off, Wenzel and Ernesto took turns punching Earl in mock frustration. "You'd better treat us to barbecue and all-night gaming sessions this summer," they demanded, only letting him off the hook once he agreed. As they rode along the riverside, they began talking about their dream colleges and future plans. "I'm aiming for Alnugo University," Earl said casually. For him, it didn't matter where he applied. After all, his acceptance was guaranteed. Wenzel, though, sighed wistfully. "I'd love to go to Alnugo too, but my scores will only get me into a decent second-tier college." Ernesto chimed in, "I'm thinking of studying medicine. I'm not sure where yet, though." The three of them dreamed of the exciting college life ahead as they pedaled under the clear blue sky. When Earl arrived home, he found his front yard crowded with reporters, education officials, and even sponsors looking to promote their brands. They all hoped Earl would share his study tips, with some even offering generous bonuses and perks if he chose to enroll in their colleges. As the hype around the state exams gradually faded, so did the constant bustle around Earl's home. In the weeks that followed, Earl spent most of his time immersed in music composition and guitar practice. When not lost in melodies, he dove into computer training courses. Earl's learning speed far outpaced that of the average student. Soon, he was no longer just a learner. He became a collaborator with Patrick, a college senior who was deeply involved in designing gaming cheat softwares. To Patrick, Earl possessed extraordinary talent and insight. Within a short time, Earl advanced from being a novice to a trusted partner. Earl had a knack for pinpointing problems in cheat designs and offering creative solutions. His ideas, like adding new features to enhance gameplay or implementing tools to make gaming easier, often transformed ordinary projects into extraordinary ones. These tweaks gave Patrick's plug-in studio a stellar reputation in the industry. With the rise of online gaming, plug-in studios had become a booming business. While Patrick, a computer science major at Alnugo University, had started dabbling in plug-in design as a freshman, his small studio mainly relied on imitation. Compared to the industry's giants, it struggled to stand out. Even so, Patrick had built a comfortable fortune over the years, thanks to the steady income from plug-in development. Chapter 20. During the month Earl worked with Patrick, his involvement not only significantly boosted productivity but also brought creative tweaks that made Patrick's plug-in software incredibly popular. The plug-in studio's revenue doubled almost overnight. Even large companies that had once looked down on Patrick's modest plug-in studio began to imitate its innovations. Some even extended offers of collaboration, hoping to tap into its sudden success. Despite Patrick's enthusiastic invitation for a long-term partnership, Earl neither accepted nor outright declined. Earl needed money, and working with Patrick for just 1 month had earned him tens of thousands of dollars in compensation. However, he harbored concerns about the plug-in industry. He understood that it was a gray area teetering on the edge of legality, and diving deeper into it could bring significant risks. Earl often found himself pondering how to harness his skills in a way that could generate legitimate income. Recently, he had also started studying psychology in his spare time. He reasoned that since he had already mastered programming techniques, perhaps he and Patrick could create a game together. Unlike plugins, the gaming industry was entirely above board and could still be highly profitable. However, this idea was still in its infancy. Earl knew he needed to refine his technical skills further, deepen his understanding of psychology, and strengthen his collaboration with Patrick. Only then could he confidently work toward achieving his first major breakthrough. In his spare time, Earl composed another song. However, he wasn't entirely satisfied with it. Both the lyrics and melody fell short when compared to his debut piece, Time. This realization struck Earl deeply. Talent in songwriting was important, but countless classics were born from relentless refinement, a perfect blend of timing, opportunity, and the creator's mindset. No wonder those who produce only a handful of hits in their lifetime can still be revered as legends, Earl mused, feeling a newfound respect for the art of creation. When he wasn't composing, Earl made sure to stay active. After nearly 3 months of summer training, his physical strength had improved remarkably. He now confidently believed he could take on dozens of opponents single-handedly without breaking a sweat. As for his mysterious ability to control electricity, progress was slow but steady. Though he hadn't mastered it fully, Earl was grateful for any advancement. The fact that he possessed such a unique gift was already an incredible stroke of luck. Time flew by, and soon, the long-awaited college acceptance letters arrived. Ernesto was accepted into a prestigious medical college, fulfilling his dream of becoming a doctor. Wenzel, too, achieved his goal of enrolling in Alnugo University of Technology, a second-tier college located in the bustling city of Alnugo. Although it wasn't a top-tier school, its location in such a thriving metropolis meant its admissions score often exceeded those of first-tier colleges by several points. As for Earl, he chose to major in finance at Alnugo University. Despite not applying to the nation's top 2 colleges, his title as the state's top science student more than compensated for any perceived shortcoming. When Seton High School learned of Earl's decision, they offered no objections. After all, the prestige of having produced the state's top student brought them immense pride. Earl himself felt assured. With his achievements, he could attend any college he wanted. The new semester soon arrived. Earl's and Wenzel's father had initially planned to accompany the 2 young men to their college orientation but were met with firm rejection. Since both of them were now adults and traveling together, their elders relented, allowing them to embark on this journey on their own. Alnugo was known as the Eastern Star of Splendor. This city was a brand new world for the 2 newcomers setting foot in it for the first time. Through the car window, the bustling streets flashed by. Skyscrapers towering into the sky, luxury cars weaving in and out of traffic. Every time they passed a landmark or building that Wenzel had only seen in books, he couldn't help but point it out with excitement. Both of their colleges were located within the same college district, which hosted over a dozen different institutions. Among them, Alnugo University undoubtedly stood out as the crown jewel. Alnugo University boasted an expansive, open campus and a grand, majestic entrance. In contrast, Alnugo University of Technology appeared somewhat dated. Its moss-covered gates, towering ancient trees, and vintage architecture exuded a deep sense of cultural heritage. Even the security guard lounging at the pavilion, engrossed in a copy of The Gilded Bloom, added to the college's unique charm. The campus was alive with activity. Decorative lights lined the pathways, the rarely used fountains were in full display, and banners welcoming new students were everywhere. Some of it was humorous, some were playful, infusing the college with vibrancy and liveliness. Earl independently completed all the registration procedures, hauling his bags as he made his way to the dormitory. His arrival didn't go unnoticed. Several girls turned their heads to look at him. But when they spotted the knockoff, Adidas logo on his clothing, their curious gazes quickly turned into looks of disdain. Earl, unfazed, continued walking toward his assigned dorm. The path leading to the dormitories, though weathered, was lined with lush greenery, giving it a serene and historic ambiance. The students passing by were dressed stylishly. They were not particularly stunning in appearance, but their scholarly aura made them captivating. Following the directions, Earl eventually arrived at Building 12. At the entrance, a couple was in the midst of a heated argument. The boy was tall and handsome, while the girl had her back turned to Earl. Her wavy hair and trendy outfit hinted at her beauty. Her slender waist and alluring figure, accentuated by a pair of denim shorts, caught Earl's attention for a moment. The girl's voice, which was sweet yet filled with fury, suddenly rang out. "Andres, how dare you? You've already found someone else the moment you started college. Fine, do you think I can't live without you? Watch me find a boyfriend right now to show you." Though she was yelling, her melodious voice still stirred ripples in Earl's heart. At that moment, the girl turned around, her eyes locking onto Earl, who stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights. She raised her hand and beckoned to him. Her tone was commanding. "You, come here." Earl finally got a clear look at the girl, Belle. Unlike Bianca's ethereal elegance or Faye's girl-next-door charm, Belle's beauty carried a hint of wildness, a touch of pride, and a dash of allure. Glancing around to confirm that he was indeed the one being called, Earl frowned and asked, "What do you want?" Before the girl could respond, the boy, Andres, burst into laughter. He asked, "Belle, are you serious? Look at him. He's dressed like a broke loser. And you're okay with that?" Belle ignored Andres's mockery. She stormed over to Earl and grabbed his hand, holding her head high. She told Andres, "He's my boyfriend now. If anything happens between us from now on, it's all your fault." Andres rolled his eyes, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Belle, I don't have time to play house with you. I've got better things to do, so enjoy your little drama with this loser." With that, he turned and walked away, completely dismissing Earl as insignificant. As Andres disappeared from sight, Belle's anger boiled over, and tears welled up in her eyes. She turned to Earl, her expression hardening with determination. "What's your name, and what's your student ID number?" she asked, her voice resolute.